A Colt single-action Army revolver cost $13.50 when it first left the factory floor. That was 1873, the same year the frontier was still being drawn in blood and bad decisions, and most working men in the American West earned less than $30 a month. For the price of half a paycheck, a man could acquire the tool that mythology would spend the next century turning into a god. But the mythology got almost everything wrong. The quick-draw duel, two men facing each other in a dusty street, one pulling iron faster than the eye can follow, is largely a 20th century invention. Hollywood didn't adapt the West, it replaced it. And the men who most convincingly inhabited that invented world were not cowboys. They were dancers, war veterans, and a Finnish-American craftsman with a sheet of steel and a very specific idea about the laws of physics. Every Hollywood performer who strapped on a six-shooter in the 1950s was competing inside a system built almost entirely by one man, and his name is almost completely unknown today, even though his work appears in the opening credits of one of the longest-running television series in American history. There is a moment in 1972 at Paramount Studios where the man officially recognized as the fastest human being with a firearm stood across from a 46-year-old entertainer, a man better known for tap shoes than trigger fingers, and watched something happen that he later described as a force of nature. What he saw was 0.18 seconds. For context, the human eye requires 0.1 seconds just to register that something has moved. And the most decorated soldier in American history, a man who once stood alone on a burning tank destroyer and held off 6 German tanks, was so certain of his own speed that when a rival actor offered a wager on the draw, Murphy raised the stakes and insisted they use live ammunition. The other man walked away. Arvo Ojala arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, a Finnish-American craftsman and stuntman from a country that didn't romanticize the West but understood engineering. He found a world of over 100 Western performers touring the country, all of them drawing guns in essentially the same awkward theatrical way they always had. The holster was the problem. Traditional leather rigs were soft, unlined, functional things built to protect a firearm from rain and trail dust during long days on horseback. They were practical objects. They were not fast objects. Ojala's solution was a thin sheet of steel sandwiched between layers of leather, patent number 2,832,519. The steel-lined speed rig created a rigid permanent cavity that held the revolver loose and ready. When a shooter's hand descended, the gun didn't drag against collapsing leather. It came out clean, and the hammer could be cocked with the thumb while the barrel was still inside the holster, a technique that removed an entire mechanical step from the process and shaved fractions of a second that, at this level of competition, were the difference between everything. Ojala's students read like a Hollywood roll call: James Arness, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Hugh O'Brien. His most visible legacy is in the opening credits of Gunsmoke, the television western that ran for 20 years, where Ojala himself is the gunfighter Marshal Matt Dillon cuts down in the street. That scene, played at the top of every episode for 2 decades, reportedly earned him enough in royalties to purchase multiple Cadillacs. Today, James Arness's original Ojala rig sold at auction for $3,900. It was a few hundred when it was made. That gap is the measure of what Ojala built. Glenn Ford operated on the other side of that equation, not a craftsman, but a craftsman's best student. Ford held the official Hollywood title for years, fastest gun in the studio system, with a draw and fire time documented at 0.4 seconds. The technique that got him there was specific. In his 1956 film, The Fastest Gun Alive, Ford demonstrated what became known as the belt drag cocking method, cocking the revolver with his thumb as it cleared the leather, firing once just above the holster, and then in a single continuous forward thrust, dragging the hammer spur against his belt to cock and fire a second round before most men had finished their first. The smell of blank powder on a film set has a particular sharpness to it, a chemical bite that actors describe as addictive. Ford knew that smell very well. His background was military, decorated Marine in World War II, later a Navy captain, and he brought a soldier's discipline to repetition. He didn't just practice the draw, he practiced it until there was nothing left to practice. Here's the thing about speed that no Western ever really addressed. The man in the street wasn't trying to be fast, he was trying to stay alive. There's a version of this history that gets passed down, in films, in tourist brochures, in the mythology that accumulated around places like Tombstone and Dodge City, that makes the frontier feel like a stage. Two men, high noon, a moral reckoning played out in quarter seconds. But the actual historical record of gunfights in the American West is not cinematic. It is chaotic, close, and mostly conducted by frightened people in poor light. Wild Bill Hickok's most famous engagement, the Hickok Tut Shootout of 1865, the one Hollywood borrowed most, was at 75 yards. Both men took deliberate aim. It was a test of marksmanship, not reflexes. Most gunfights happened in dark saloons at ranges where missing was almost impossible. What Hollywood sold wasn't history. It was a set of values dressed in a costume. And the men who made that costume believable, who actually spent thousands of hours perfecting a skill that had never really existed in the way they were performing it, deserved to be understood for what they actually were. They were athletes, they were artists, and a few of them were something more complicated than either. Jay Silverheels was a Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, a world-class lacrosse player and stuntman who came to Hollywood and found himself in a role that the industry had already decided for him before he arrived. Tonto, the faithful sidekick, a character who spoke in a broken, fabricated English that Silverheels privately found humiliating and that bore no relationship to how any actual indigenous person spoke. Silverheels was an exceptional horseman and a skilled gun handler, the real physical vocabulary of the Western, and he used that mastery quietly, in small gestures within scenes, to assert something the role itself denied him. He eventually founded a school for indigenous actors, specifically so that Native performers would have the training to compete for roles on their own terms rather than waiting for Hollywood to offer them whatever trope was available. His legacy is not Tonto. It is the institution he built in Tonto's shadow. Western peaked on American television in the late 1950s. At one point, there were 35 separate Western series airing in a single season. Gunsmoke, Maverick, The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, an entire national mythology projected into living rooms every evening. And somewhere in that saturation, the gap between what the West had actually been and what it looked like on screen became permanent. You don't see what's missing, you only see a slightly smoother motion. The men who actually knew the difference, the technical advisors, the veterans, the performers who had done real work with real firearms, mostly kept quiet about it. The myth was the product, but some of them pushed back in the only language available to them, sheer, demonstrable, irrefutable skill. Sammy Davis Jr. came to the fast draw the way he came to everything, with an obsessive, rhythmic, dancer's intelligence that didn't distinguish between disciplines. He was a musician who understood that speed is a function of timing, not force. He was a dancer who had spent his life thinking about kinetic energy and how to direct it. When Arvo Ojala put a steel-lined holster in his hand, Davis found something that operated by the same physics as a downbeat. His documented speed was 0.18 seconds, a number that requires some context to understand. At 24 frames per second, the film standard of the era, a 0.18 second draw occupies approximately 4 frames of footage. 4 frames. Scientific analysis of comparable draws revealed that the hand undergoes roughly 10 Gs of force during the acceleration phase, more than the threshold at which trained jet fighter pilots lose consciousness. The deceleration required to stop the gun and fire without overshooting adds a second wave of force that demands specialized bone density and tendon strength. This is not a party trick. This is an athletic feat with the physiological demands of a contact sport. In 1972, at Paramount Studios, Bob Munden came to Hollywood. Munden held the Guinness World Record, officially, documentably, the fastest man with a firearm who had ever lived. He was 30 years old and accustomed to being the fastest person in any room he entered. What he encountered was a 46-year-old entertainer who drew and fired in 0.18 seconds. Munden's reported reaction was not competitive. It was awe. He described what he saw not as a draw, but as a force of nature. Davis, who had grown up in a segregated industry, where a black Jewish entertainer was required to be better than the best, simply to be accepted, had quietly built something that no one could argue with, a record held in the body, proved in front of witnesses, measured in fractions of a second that left no room for interpretation. I went through this research expecting to find a horse race. Fastest draw, measured times, a leaderboard. What I found instead was a set of people using a very specific, very strange skill to solve problems that had nothing to do with shooting. Ojala used it to build something that outlasted him. Ford used it to maintain the discipline of a military mind in the civilian world. Silverheels used it to hold a space open for people who would come after him. Davis used it to walk into rooms that were not built for him and leave them changed. And Jerry Lewis, of all people, used it as medicine. Lewis, who was known to the world as a comedian, was in a period of genuine mental health struggle when he took up the fast draw. Some sources, including Bob Munden himself, believed Lewis may have been the fastest natural talent ever to touch a speed rig, potentially faster than Davis in his prime. Lewis's speed is visible in the 1956 film Pardners, where his gun handling is objectively elite and where you can see the concentration on his face that had nothing to do with comedy. He was using this precise, physical, measurable thing to stay grounded in a period when staying grounded was hard. That's not a metaphor. That's just what actually happened. The fast draw, this invented athletic discipline masquerading as frontier history, turned out to be genuinely useful for reasons no one had anticipated. Audie Murphy was 21 years old when he stood alone on a burning tank destroyer near Holtzwihr, France, and fired a .50 caliber machine gun into 6 German tanks and hundreds of advancing infantrymen. He had already been wounded. He held his position for an hour. The engagement earned him the Medal of Honor and made him the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He spent 400 days on the front lines and was credited with killing more than 240 enemy soldiers. He came to Hollywood carrying all of that, the reflexes, the calm under fire, the particular stillness of a man who has already decided he is willing to die. Gary Cooper gave him a custom-modified 1905 Colt Bisley flat-top target revolver as a gift, a firearm with a lowered, wider hammer spur and a grip specifically engineered to reduce recoil and accelerate recovery for a second shot. Murphy practiced with it constantly. His draw time was never officially documented in competition because he never competed officially. Hugh O'Brien, who held a verified 0.25-second draw and had publicly offered a $500 wager to any actor who could beat him, challenged Murphy. Murphy raised the stakes to $2,500 and insisted on live ammunition. O'Brien declined. That is the answer that matters. Not a timer, not a frame count. An experienced, trained, decorated shooter looked at Audie Murphy and decided the risk was real. In a real gunfight, the research is consistent. The fastest draw doesn't win. The coolest head wins. The man who fires accurately while the other man panics wins. Speed is a Hollywood metric. Murphy operated by a different one, the kind that is only fully available to someone who has already been to the place where it counts. The Colt that Gary Cooper gave him sold at auction for $90,675. It cost $1,350 when it left the factory. This week, find one person in your life who grew up watching these westerns when they first aired, not in reruns, but on a Tuesday night when the set was new and the antenna needed adjusting and the whole family sat in the same room. Ask them which character they believed in, not which one was their favorite, which one they actually believed. Because that question gets at something this whole history is really about. The Western wasn't a documentary. It was a mirror, a reflection of what Americans in the 1950s needed to see about themselves. Courage is individual, justice is visible. The right man winning because he was faster, and because being faster meant being right. The actual fast draw, the real athletic discipline, the steel holsters, The 10 Gs, the 4 frames of film, was built by craftsmen and veterans and people the mythology often had no room for. They built it anyway. They were precise about it. They were serious about it. They made it beautiful. What gets remembered isn't always what was real. But sometimes what was real is more interesting than the memory. Tell me in the comments, which Western actor did you grow up watching? And did you ever believe for a moment that they were the real thing?